7 presentation at LD Micro. Thank you for hanging around to the very, very last presentation of the conference. And again, welcome. And I'm Raouf Halim, CEO of Spectra7. What I intend to do in this presentation is give you an introduction to the company, and in particular the core technology that the company is exercising today in the market, the particular problems that we're solving, and then I will develop for you the multiple end markets that Spectra7 is addressing with great success today. Let me first remind you the presentation is provided obviously under our safe harbor, which is on our website as well. So Spectra7 is a high-performance analog semiconductor company, so it's a chip company based in San Jose, California. We are headquartered in San Jose, but also have operations in Little Rock, Arkansas, and in South China, in Dongguan, South China. And we're listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, or TSX, under symbol SEV, SEV. And the company was incorporated in 2010, listed on the Toronto Stock Ventures, or TSV, in 2012, and uplisted to the TSX in 2015. So we've been in business 10 years. We've been revenue generating for about 5 years of that time frame. As I mentioned, we are focused on analog semiconductor products. That's an important distinction to make between digital and analog. With digital products, you tend to have very complex developments, very large teams, and then also it's a high CapEx, high capital expenditure kind of business model. Where with analog, you can produce very high performance, very distinguished components that enjoy high gross margins as well as being CapEx light. So light capital expenditure, a very important attribute of our business model. We are the leader in a number of markets, which I will develop for you later in the presentation. Most notable is AR, VR, so augmented and virtual reality. We're continuing to grow that space for us as we continue to establish and grow our business in adjacent connectivity markets, which I will also introduce, in particular, such as the data center. So if you look on the right-hand side, you will see a depiction of where our products are deployed. And in particular, we are in what's called the interconnect market. Okay? So a pretty good example is this visualization of a cable, illustration of a cable right here, where Spectra7 provides our products is components, so semiconductor chips, as well as modules, namely boards, that are built into or designed into the connector on either end of the cable. So as opposed to a plain old cable, which as you might visualize, copper with simply connectors on either end, this category of cables are termed active cables because they have active electronics within the connector on either end of the cable bundle. Okay? We enjoy a dominant position in active cables, which I'll talk about quite a bit more in the presentation. But just to give you a sense for who our customer base is, these are all customers that have designed Spectra7 into their interconnect cables, are in production and revenue generating today for Spectra7. Includes names such as Monster Cable, obviously one of the leaders in the category, Samsung, HP, other PC OEMs such as Lenovo. We also have been in production now for a number of years with Facebook Oculus, if you're familiar with the leader of the virtual reality marketplace, Oculus. Their copper cable that you would see, for instance, if you tested a device at Best Buy or if you bought one off of Amazon, the cable that comes with it that connects the VR head-mounted display to a host, a laptop or a desktop, that cable is powered by Spectra7, just as another example. HTC, the Vive device, and others are also enabled by Spectra7 technology, embedded within, again, the cable that connects the head-mounted display to the host computer. So that, in a nutshell, is the company and the connectivity application that Spectra7 serves today. Give you a sense for some of the key statistics of Spectra7. It is a small company currently listed on the TSX, as I mentioned. The share price as of the end of September was 15 cents, that's 1.5, corresponding to a market cap of just over 30 million Canadian. Trailing 12 months revenue were about 5.7 million US. Revenues came under a little bit of pressure in the first 3 quarters, actually 2 quarters of 2018. There was some excess inventory of VR products for the Microsoft Windows 10 device, another device that Spectra7 has been designed into and shipped into in 2017. There's a little bit of overhang from Christmas 2017 of product inventory that depressed our revenues in the first half. We have now reported Q3 that was up sequentially quite strongly, about 30%. And we expect Q4, the current quarter, to be a very strong quarter for Spectra7. Let me comment quickly about Q4. There's no additional material on our financials, so I'll comment quickly that what we are seeing in our core VR business, which comprises the bulk of our revenues today, is that the market has now recovered from the excess channel inventory that we saw in the first half of 2018. Orders are coming in strongly. Our backlog going into Q4 is record. It's the highest backlog we've had in over a year. So we're in a very, very good position to enjoy significant growth for Q4, and as we look beyond into 2019, we see a number of important drivers, including particularly the data center ramp that will produce revenues that will sit on top of the core VR business, which now is strong and we believe will also grow in 2019 over 2018. So we're feeling pretty good about the business trends right now in the business. I would also point out to you that our gross margins are quite rich, sitting at about 54% for the trailing 12 months. And for a semiconductor company that's largely to date in consumer applications, such as consumer HDMI and VR, as I mentioned, to enjoy margins of 54% is obviously a testimony to the uniqueness of the product, the single source nature of it, and the high performance that it enables. We're very proud of our gross margins, and we actually expect gross margins to go up over time as our data center business starts to ramp, because that business will be at higher incremental gross margins than the core consumer VR business. Insider ownership is roughly 5%. I personally have a big piece of that, including investments I've made personally in Spectra7 over a couple of rounds of financings. Okay? So with that, let me give you a couple of investment highlights about Spectra7. First and foremost, we address significant and very real markets today. VR being one where we enjoy a dominant position in the tethered segment. So wherever you have to have a tether to connect your VR head-mounted display or headset, sometimes referred to a host computer. That may be a laptop, it may be a desktop, a high-performance desktop of some kind. That is almost invariably, as far as we know, Spectra7 in every single instance. So we enjoy a dominant position in the VR market. It's not a very large market right now, continues to grow, and we expect it at some point to start accelerating. And in particular, the data center, which, as I will show you in later slides, is roughly 100x the size, 100x the size of the VR market today. It's a very large and very rich market that itself is also continuing to grow at a CAGR, compounded annual growth rate, of roughly 60%, 60. So large and growing markets. We are the leader in the VR segment, as I mentioned earlier, and we have a dominant share of active copper cables within the VR platform. We'll talk a lot about the data center. We'll talk a lot to the interconnect value proposition that we bring to the data center, which again is a very large market and that is also continuing to grow rapidly. A very strong value proposition, both in terms of cost and power savings within the data center infrastructure. And we'll talk about our traction. Design wins that are public, including a couple very recently that are very material. And we're in production today with a number of end customers. I've showed you some of the logos, Foxconn being one, Facebook, Oculus, Luxe in China, Amphenol, and others. And we enjoy a CapEx light model, as opposed to, let's say, memory components or processors or other very large digital type of ICs. I myself have been running the company now for just over 2 years, brought in a number of very experienced, talented execs to complement the team at Spectra7. Okay, let me first develop for you the opportunities that Spectra7 is serving and our IP, our intellectual property, and how we bring significant value to the interconnect market. First of all, where's cabling? Cabling is used everywhere, right? Anytime you want to connect one system to another system or consumer device, let's say a television, a monitor, to a host of some kind, another computer, you need a cable. Cabling is ubiquitous. And in particular, copper cabling is a very large market. Copper is highly available. It's a low-cost medium. It's been deployed now in volume for connecting electronics for over 130 years since the phone was invented. So it's extremely available, it's ubiquitous, and it's low cost. Okay? The problem with copper cabling is that it has a number of impairments, a number of weaknesses, a number of limitations that affect how fast you can run the signal over a copper cable. Okay? You can only go so fast, so far. So copper cabling inherently has limitations. And what Spectra7 is all about is compensating for the limitations of the copper cable with electronics. Think of it very simply as a booster, as a signal compensation or boosting device that measures the problems, the impairments, the shortcomings of the copper medium, measures them, and pre-compensates for those problems, allowing the signal to go further, to go faster, over a smaller gauge, a thinner copper cable. Okay? Another way to think about it, and I'd like to use this analogy with investors, is like an equalizer for high-end home stereo. Right? If you think about a high-fidelity system that you may have in your family room, you pay a lot of money for that. You want great audio performance out of your stereo. Sometimes you have impairments and problems that come about from furniture in your room, right? So quite often people will install an equalizer that measures and compensates for those impairments within the listening environment. It's a lot like that, except it's much faster, and it's not obviously for a high fidelity or an audio system. This is more for signal transmission over a copper medium. Okay? The net of it, as you see in the bottom right-hand of the slide, is that we're able to cut the diameter, sometimes known as the gauge, of copper cables by a factor of 10, using our devices on either end of that copper bundle. And that's huge, both in terms of cost, both in terms of bending radius for a cable bundle, and as I'll show you and elaborate on later in the presentation, in terms of power, as compared, let's say, to other alternative connectivities. So this is a very important category of interconnect. It's a new category that Spectra7 is pioneering, is now deployed in a number of markets, HDMI cabling being one, increasingly VR being another one, and very soon to data center infrastructure. Okay? So within the data center, typically the interconnect, let's say behind the rack of servers, is either of two different types. It's either plain old passive copper, okay, which again is ubiquitous and very inexpensive, or when the data rates get high, let's say 100 gigabits per second or even faster, it's optical, active optical cable, or AOC as it's known. A large number of suppliers of AOC technology, everything from the ICs to the modules to the transceivers to the systems, many names, Finisars, JDSUs, component vendors, so on and so forth, have targeted the AOC or active optical space as it's emerged as an important technology for high-speed connectivity. Okay? Problem with passive copper is it tops out at roughly 2 meters or so of length. You can't get much longer than 2 meters when you carry high-speed data over plain old passive copper. You just can't because the medium has a lot of limitations and, as I mentioned, impairments. The category that we're pioneering, that is deploying now, is active copper cable. The acronym is ACC in the industry. And what that does, think of it as sort of extending the usefulness, the life, and the benefits of plain old passive copper cabling. Okay? So with our electronics on either end of an inexpensive copper cable, we're able to carry data at 25 gigabits per second, 100 gigabits per second, 400 gigabits per second, okay, over the same inexpensive copper medium that has been around a long, long time. And compared, for instance, to the alternative, which is optical, it is a small fraction of the power dissipation. And I'll quantify that for you as I go through the presentation. Importantly, Spectra7 is protected by 53 issued patents, both domestically and as well as overseas. So we have we believe, a very big moat, strong moat around this market, protected by our intellectual property position. We enjoy high gross margins, as I showed you earlier. We're single source with every single customer of ours in the industry today. So we feel very good about our position as well as the outlook for the company, Q4 and beyond. The markets we serve at a high level are shown on this slide. At the top half of the slide, you see the market that really has driven a lot of the growth at Spectra7 over the past few years, which is the augmented and virtual reality, AR/VR market segment. And within that, there's two pieces. There's the blue piece you see at the bottom. These are PC or laptop connected devices. Facebook Oculus device being a very good example. An HP, a Dell, Lenovo kind of VR, or sometimes called MR, mixed reality devices, are all very good examples of that. We dominate that segment. That's the blue piece at the bottom. The gray piece on top of that is consoles. It's game consoles. Think a good example of that would be the Sony PlayStation VR, PSVR. Okay? It's very similar to the PC type device, except instead of the head-mounted display being tethered to a laptop, it's tethered to a game console. Okay? So to date, so far, that gray piece, which is console connected, has been passive, just plain old passive copper cables. We have a very important design win, we cannot name right now, but a very important design win in that segment that we expect to go to production in the not too distant future, which, as the TAM would indicate, would at least double, again, at least double the revenues coming out of our AR/VR segment. Okay? We dominate the blue piece, and the gray piece today we don't enjoy any revenue out of, but as that design win goes to production, again, we expect to roughly double the core VR business. That design win is going very strong, tremendous amount of development and testing and pre-deployment activities going, and we expect that this would be a big thing for us quite soon. Now, the bottom half of this slide, you see a depiction of the other very important marketplace that we're pursuing. I've already mentioned it a couple of times, which is the data center infrastructure. Notable here is that it's roughly 100x the size of the VR market. It's big today, and it's growing rapidly. In fact, I think the next slide talks to that a little bit better. So in 2017, this was a $4 billion marketplace, expected to grow to about almost $10 billion, okay, by 2025. This is the interconnect opportunity. So we're looking at just the cabling behind the racks. Okay, so from switch to routers, switch to servers, and from one rack to neighboring racks. Okay, so all the cabling opportunity, not the electronics inside the boxes, but really all the stuff that's connecting the boxes to each other and to switches. That's a very large market today, and it's, I would say, compared to the electronics inside the box, it's far less served. It's not as populated with competitors and players as, let's say, inside the box. Okay? So we love this space. We know the space very well. And where does ACC or active copper cable play? The technology that I developed for you a few minutes ago. This is a nice slide because it shows that pretty handily. So within the data center, you've got cables of all lengths, all types, speeds, and lengths. Okay? So where active copper cable fits in is the green swath right in the middle here of this particular slide. And let me explain what you're looking at here, because it's not intuitive, I know, but up to 2 meters of length of cabling within a data center, that can be addressed with plain old passive copper cable. Just plain old, unboosted, ultra inexpensive copper cables. Okay? So 1 to 2 meters that will remain, we believe, passive copper for the long term. Anything above 7 meters going to tens and maybe hundreds of meters within the data center will continue to require optical. We cannot touch that. We cannot get to those reaches or those lengths of cabling with our active copper cable technology. Where we fit is right in the middle, which actually ends up being about 90%, roughly 90% of the cabling within a data center lies between the lengths of 2 meters and 7 meters. Okay? So that's exactly the segment of the market that we are, if you will, driving a truck right through. A very exciting opportunity for Spectra7. 90% of the TAM is the segment that we are pursuing. Okay? And I'll develop for you our value prop within that segment in the next couple of slides. Most importantly is low power. So if you talk to any hyperscaler data center operator, just to throw out some random names, an Amazon, Microsoft Azure, an Alibaba, a Tencent, any one of those operators, and if you were to ask them, what's the number one item of your operational costs on an annual basis to operate your hyperscale data centers? They will all give you exactly the same answer. It's the power bill. The power bill, because these systems generate so much thermal energy, so much heat, that the power bill is extraordinarily high just to run the systems and to cool the data center. Okay, I'm being given a 5-minute sign here in the back. I'll try to accelerate. Though I don't think there's anyone after me, but I'll try to go quickly. So what we do with the value proposition we provide is shown in blue. That's the power dissipation of active copper cable. That's our stuff. Versus red, which is active optical cable, or AOC. Okay? When the world was slower, on the left, 1 gig and 10 gigabits per second, there wasn't really much difference in power, wasn't that pronounced. Get to 100 gig, we cut the power by roughly a factor of 7. The world is moving to 400 gig. We expect 2019 to be a big year, the beginning of a huge rollout of 400 gigabit systems, 400 gigabit data centers, 400 gigabit interconnect. That is going to kick into high gear in 2019. That's clear as daylight. And in that interconnect topology, we cut the power by a factor of 10. Okay? From roughly 25 watts to about 2.5 watts or so. Very significant power saving. At the end of the day, what that corresponds to in terms of savings for an operator, again, an Amazon or an Alibaba, you name, or Google, eBay, any one of those guys, is roughly $20 million a year savings in the power bill. That gets their attention. So we evangelize this technology to operators, but we actually sell our product to the guys who make the cable harness. Okay? We've made tremendous progress in the data center market. And I won't walk through the slide in too much detail, other than to point out that at this point, we have announced that we've accumulated 36, again, that's 36 major design wins in the data center infrastructure. They're all at various stages. There are some that are done with prototyping, pilot builds, and now going in very early deployments of production starting this quarter, going to 2019. And some are a little bit behind in terms of the testing and prototyping process, but there's 36 of those. There's a handful that we've been able to announce publicly. You see the logos here. Amphenol, which I think many people would recognize the name. Foxconn Interconnect. Foxconn's been working with us now for, gosh, well over a year, almost 2 years now. We're very far along with Foxconn at data rates from 25 to 100 to 400 gigabits per second. 3 weeks ago, we announced that Molex Corporation has designed in Spectra7. That's not a small deal. It's a pretty big deal because Molex enjoys very significant market share in the data center, particularly in interconnect. They are the guy to win. They are the 800-pound gorilla, so to speak, and that was a big proclamation for us. There's a number of very important manufacturers of copper cabling in China. I won't rattle off the names, but you see a couple here. There's a whole bunch of other guys as well who serve the local markets. Okay? So since we introduced the product roughly 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago, we've been evangelizing technology while we've been winning designs with cable manufacturers. Our revenues have been growing sequentially every single quarter. The early revenues started with from nothing to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, and we expect this quarter, we are now in production with this technology and expect a very significant year with the first operator out the chute in China with this technology in 2019. Okay, so we're there now. The first guy out the chute is going to be deploying starting now and deploying heavily in 2019. In the VR market, I won't talk about it very much. This is, again, we enjoy 100% share here. The space has had its ups and downs, it's stable and starting to grow again. I think we're past the so-called trough of disillusionment. You think about the development cycle of new technology, we're certainly past all the hype and through the trough, and it's slowly starting to grow now. This is just a sampling of the OEMs who are in volume production today with Spectra7 for VR. It's a very impressive list, I'm sure you would agree. Many of those names are in the data center as well. So the fact that we have partnerships with them on their approved vendor list or AVL helps us enormously in the data center initiative. And we're able to support everything in the VR space, all the different applications, resolutions, et cetera, all the way up to 50 gigabits. So with that, just to recap, large end markets, growing end markets, a bevy of tier ones, very strong, proven technology in volume production today, on the cusp of big things in the data center. So with that, I think I'm down to 1 minute for questions. Of course, I'm around if you have questions after the session. Sure. That's a very, very large game console supplier. I can't name the name because we're under NDA. But if you know the VR gaming, again, not the PC, but you think a guy selling, you know, VR games and game systems, that's the guy. So, when does it ramp? We don't know I can't give you the exact quarter. I don't know really, but they're very far along with this technology. They plan it for a refresh of their game console. Typically, the refresh is done sort of Christmas time, or sort of they launch it the quarter before to developers who are developing games on that platform, and then the big push is over Christmas. Typically, that's what we've seen from them. Yeah, I can't go any more detail on that, but it is big. It will more than double our revenues, quite a bit more. Sir, yes. Yes, we are consuming cash today, huh? So we just closed the private placement roughly a month ago. It was a non-brokered private placement. We raised roughly 3.7 million US or 5 million Canadian. It was significantly oversubscribed. We had a lot of demand, a lot of interest. Do we need further financing? Probably at some point in the future, yeah. For working capital, as data center ramp hits really hard, I think we're going to have to probably bolster the balance sheet, yeah. Okay, one more question. Yeah. 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 Yes. So for the short reach, for the very short reach, sub 2 meters, yes, they are, you know, SFP, QSFP, and in some cases what's called QSFP DD or double density. And so they get up to data rates of 400 gig, yes. Sub 2 meters, that's right. At some point, this industry will move to 800 gig. There's a lot of talk about that. And at that point, I'm not sure there'll be much passive copper cable left. Okay, thank you all very much.